Ever feel like you hear about these big government changes, but figuring out what they actually mean is, well, it's like trying to read another language.
Yeah, I can definitely feel that way.
So today, we're kind of acting as your translators. We're diving into a pretty significant recent development, a brand new executive order all about law enforcement.
That's right. And this isn't just, a minor tweak. This order, signed April 28th, 2025, it has a title that's pretty direct about strengthening law enforcement. It could really reshape policing across the country.
And how the federal government gets involved with, your local police force.
Exactly.
So our job today, it's pretty straightforward. We want to break down this executive order so it actually makes sense, explain what it says, what it could mean for your community, maybe your rights, and what the ripple effects might be.
Mm-hmm. And we're basing this on an AI analysis of the whole order, so we've got a pretty detailed roadmap to follow.
Think of this as your fast track to getting up to speed.
Yeah, we'll cover the main ideas behind it, how it plans to boost the federal role, the resources, and also touch on the different reactions and potential impacts people are already talking about.
Okay, let's get started then.
Let's do it.
All right, Section 1. This lays out the purpose and policy. What's the main thrust here? What are they trying to achieve?
Well, the core idea seems to be a really strong federal push to bolster law enforcement. It says right there, the goal is empowering state and local police to tackle crime aggressively, ensure public safety.
Okay, aggressive tackling of crime.
Right. And it also takes a bit of a swipe at local leaders, suggesting some are limiting police authority and that those limits might be, contributing to crime.
So a pretty clear message.
Mm-hmm.
More power to the police, less local interference maybe. And it mentions equity policies specifically.
It does, very specifically. It explicitly rejects race and sex-based equity policies in policing, calls them harmful and illegal.
Harmful and illegal, wow.
Yeah. According to this section, the administration's focus is purely on crime reduction, not on those kinds of equity initiatives within police departments.
So basically, the federal government seems to be signaling it wants to push back against local efforts that are focused on equity or, addressing potential bias in policing.
That seems to be the message. It's definitely reflecting a viewpoint that prioritizes, let's say, traditional crime-fighting methods above all else.
Got it. Okay, main message. Less local restriction, more federal backing, focus on traditional policing over equity reforms.
Yep.
Let's move to Section 2 then. Legal defense of law enforcement officers. What's the key takeaway here?
Okay, Section 2 tells the Attorney General to set up a system, basically, to provide legal resources and something called indemnification for police officers.
Indemnification. What exactly is that in plain English?
It basically means the government would help cover the legal bills if an officer faces lawsuits or, other legal action because of something they did on duty.
Ah, okay. So financial backing for legal trouble related to the job.
Right. And the order even mentions maybe getting volunteer lawyers, pro bono help from the private sector involved too.
So if an officer is sued or charged for something that happened while they were working, the federal government is creating a structure to help defend them, maybe even pay for it.
That's the idea, yeah.
What kind of effect did that have, do you think?
Well, it could be pretty significant. It gives officers this layer of federal support when they face legal challenges.
Mm-hmm.
One potential outcome, maybe officers feel more protected, more confident taking action if they know this backing is there.
But on the flip side,
yeah.
Could it reduce accountability?
That's the big question, isn't it? Some would definitely argue that. If officers feel less personally at risk, financially or legally, because the government might step in, does that reduce the incentive to be cautious? It raises that accountability issue.
Yeah, that's a really crucial point to consider. Okay, Section 3 is called Empowering State and Local Law Enforcement. This sounds like where the practical support comes in. What are the main actions listed here?
Right. This section gets into the concrete steps. It calls for developing best practices for what it calls aggressive policing.
Aggressive policing. Does it define that?
Not specifically in the summary we have, but it suggests, proactive, assertive approaches aimed squarely at confronting crime.
Okay. What else?
It also talks about expanding and improving training, increasing officer pay and benefits, strengthening their legal protections, basically building up the support structure.
So more training, better pay, stronger legal backup.
Exactly. Plus, pushing for tougher sentences for crimes against officers, investing more in prisons, and improving how crime data is collected and shared. It's a pretty broad package.
It really is.
Right.
It all seems to point towards investing heavily in those traditional law enforcement structures. But I remember seeing something about Federal agreements with local police being reviewed.
Yes, that's a really important piece in Section 3. The Attorney General is told to review all current federal consent decrees, out-of-court settlements, and these post-judgment orders involving state or local police.
Okay, remind us. Consent decrees, those are the agreements often put in place after, like, civil rights investigations, right, to force reforms.
Precisely. They're legally binding deals between the DOJ and local departments, usually mandating specific changes.
So what's the goal of reviewing them?
The order says the review is to potentially modify, cancel, or just end any of these agreements if they're seen as unduly impeding the performance of law enforcement functions.
Unduly impeding.
Okay, so these agreements that are often about reform and accountability, they might be rolled back if they're seen as getting in the way of, well, what the order calls effective policing.
That's the potential outcome, yes. If these oversight deals are weakened or ditched, you could see less federal scrutiny, potentially rolling back reforms.
Which would definitely worry people focused on police accountability and civil rights.
Absolutely. That's a key area of concern for advocates. Right, so sections 1 through 3 really set a tone. Empower local police, potentially reduce federal oversight. Now, Section 4 talks about using national security assets for law and order. That sounds like a significant shift. What's involved there?
It is a significant step. This part directs the Attorney General and the Secretary of Defense to increase the transfer of surplus military and national security equipment, things like vehicles, gear, to local police departments.
Wait, actual military gear for local cops?
Excess military gear, yes. And it doesn't stop there. It also mandates planning on how military resources, things like training, non-lethal equipment, maybe even personnel, could be used for domestic crime prevention.
Wow, using military resources, maybe even personnel, for local crime fighting. What's the justification given?
The specific reasoning isn't laid out in detail here, but the overall epilogue emphasizes giving law enforcement the tools they need. But yeah, providing military-style equipment, potentially involving military personnel, that obviously raises concerns for a lot of people.
You mean concerns about militarization?
Exactly. The militarization of local police. How does that affect the relationship between police and the communities they serve? Does it change how policing feels on the ground? Big questions.
Huge questions. Okay, moving to Section 5. Holding state and local officials accountable. Given the direction so far, I have a feeling I know which way this accountability might flow.
That's a pretty astute observation. This section gives the Attorney General the authority to pursue legal remedies, basically. Sue state and local officials who are seen as obstructing criminal law enforcement.
Obstructing? How so?
Well, it mentions officials who willfully and unlawfully direct the obstruction of criminal law, and this connects back to Section 1 officials who use diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in a way the federal government thinks restricts police activity or endangers citizens.
So let me get this straight. If a city council passes, say, a police reform measure or an equity initiative, and the federal government doesn't like it, thinks it hinders policing, the DOJ could potentially sue those local officials.
That seems to be a possibility opened up by this section, yes. It's effectively a tool for federal intervention in local policy debates around policing and equity if those policies clash with the federal view.
That could lead to some serious friction, couldn't it? Federal versus local government.
Oh, absolutely. Significant disagreements, legal battles. It seems quite possible.
It really does sound like the federal government is asserting itself much more strongly in what have traditionally been local matters. Now, Section 6 mentions use of Homeland Security task forces. How do they fit in?
Right. Section 6 says these Homeland Security task forces, which were originally set up under a different order focused on border security, will now also be used to coordinate and push forward the goals of this new law enforcement order.
So resources and groups originally aimed at border security and, well, Homeland Security in that sense, are now being directed towards these domestic law enforcement goals too.
That's what it indicates. It's another example of shifting federal security resources towards internal, local policing issues.
It kind of underscores this view of domestic crime as a major security threat, requiring a coordinated federal response, using tools maybe not traditionally used that way.
Exactly. That seems to be the perspective driving it.
Okay, we've hit the main action sections. Section 7 is the usual general provisions bit, right? Anything crucial in the fine print.
Yeah. Section 7 is mostly standard legal boilerplate. It clarifies the order operates within existing laws, depends on available funding, And importantly, it says the order doesn't create any new legal rights that someone could use to sue the government over.
Right. The standard, this doesn't give you grounds for a lawsuit clause.
Pretty much. It's about making sure it fits within the existing legal and budget setup.
Okay, so let's zoom out. Looking at the whole picture based on this analysis, what are the core takeaways? What really stands out?
The analysis highlights a few key themes that run through it. First, a very clear effort to strengthen police power, state and local. Second, an aim to weaken oversight, particularly that federal oversight through things like consent decrees. Third, a definite move towards increased militarization of local police, giving them military gear and resources.
Right.
Fourth, it clearly targets certain reform policies, especially those around race, equity, and inclusion, painting them as potentially unlawful or counterproductive. And finally, there's this explicit threat of legal action against local officials who implement reforms the federal government sees as, quote, anti-police.
Those are really significant shifts. How might different groups react to this? What would, say, civil rights advocates likely think?
Well, civil rights groups are almost certainly going to view this with serious alarm. They likely see it as a major step backward from efforts to boost police accountability and tackle bias.
Because of the emphasis on aggressive policing and the pushback against equity.
Exactly. And the potential weakening of federal oversight through those consent decree reviews would be a huge red flag for them. It looks like undermining fair and just policing efforts.
Okay, and on the other side of the coin, what about police unions or leaders with more conservative views on law enforcement?
It's highly likely they would welcome this order. They might see it as, much needed support for officers, giving them better legal protection, more resources, maybe less hassle from local officials or federal reformers.
They might argue it lets police do their jobs more effectively, maybe reduce crime.
That would likely be the argument, yes.
Yeah.
That this empowers them to enforce the law without undue restrictions.
This really does feel like it could ramp up tensions between the federal government and certain local governments, doesn't it? Especially places actively pursuing reforms.
Oh, absolutely. You could easily see more friction, more legal fights between the feds and cities or states that have policies the administration views as obstructing law enforcement or pushing problematic equity ideas. It could get messy.
And what about the broader impact on communities, on individuals? Could we actually see like a bigger federal footprint in local policing?
The order definitely opens that door. More federal involvement could come through that military equipment pipeline or through federal lawsuits challenging local policies, or maybe even the feds getting more involved in prosecuting certain types of crimes if they feel local officials aren't doing enough. So yes, potentially a larger federal presence in areas usually handled locally.
Wow. It's a lot to take in. This executive order really seems like a major move with potentially huge consequences for policing, local government, civil rights, across the board.
It really does. It signals a clear shift in national policy, promoting a very specific vision for law enforcement and the federal role in it. Understanding the pieces and the potential effects is, well, it's crucial for anyone trying to grasp where policing might be headed.
So just to wrap things up then, we've done our deep dive into this new executive order. We've looked at its core goals, the plans to expand federal reach and resources in policing, and the kind of broader ripple effects it might have for different groups and for that federal-local balance. It's definitely a significant policy change.
No doubt about it. This order marks a fundamental change in direction for federal influence on law enforcement. The potential consequences, both the ones intended and maybe the ones nobody's foreseen yet, they really deserve close watching and continued discussion.
Absolutely. And maybe that leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener. Thinking about this shift in national policy and that tricky balance between federal power and local control, what do you think might be the single most significant potential outcome of this order? Consider all the angles we've touched on, the police perspective, local leaders, civil rights concerns, the impact on communities. What stands out to you as the biggest potential consequence of this new direction? Something to think about.